Before we get to the interview, applications for the Analyst Training Program are now open. So if you are interested in joining the Analyst Training Program, which has now resumed in-person classes but has moved to a hybrid model with 4 weekends per year in person and 5 weekends online, and that's worked really well to help make it accessible to more people who live at a distance. So if you're interested in that, just go to our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks. Welcome to the Jung Anthology podcast from the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Mythology and the Age of the Heroine with Maria Tatar. Renowned folklorist and Harvard scholar Maria Tatar joins host Patricia Martin to discuss her latest book, Heroine with 1001 Faces. In this interview, Tatar unearths the forgotten legacy of the heroine's quest, which parallels Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and illuminates the social significance of the heroine as an archetype for our times. Professor Tatar received her Ph.D. from Princeton University. Her teaching and research interests include Weimar Germany, German Romanticism, folklore, children's literature, and cultural studies. The author of books on the Brothers Grimm and on fairy tales, she has also published Spellbound, Studies on Mesmerism and Literature in Lustmord, which explores sexual violence in the literature, film, and art of the Weimar period in Germany. She is the editor of classic fairy tales as well as the Annotated Brothers Grimm and the Annotated Hans Christian Andersen. She is a senior fellow at Harvard's Society of Fellows. Now let's jump right in.
Hello, this is Patricia Martin, your host for Jung in the World. Joining us today is Maria Tatar, author of a compelling new book about mythology, Heroine with 1001 Faces. Tatar is the John L. Loeb Professor of Research at Harvard University. She's author of several books on Brothers Grimm and other fairy tales, including The Hard Facts of the Grimm's Fairy Tales, Off with Their Heads, Secrets Beyond the Door, and she's the editor of classic fairy tales, as well as the Annotated Brothers Grimm and the Annotated Hans Christian Andersen, and Enchanted Hunters, The Power of Stories in Childhood. She's also a senior fellow at Harvard University's Society of Fellows. Maria Tatar, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Let me just for a second, because we're recording this on video too, hold this beautiful book up. I pored over this book, and in fact, it was a Jungian who turned me on to this fascinating look at the hero model. And if I could just like tee this up for a second with some background on why Jungians are so fascinated with myth and fairy tales. Many of Carl Jung's theories can be tied back to myths and fairy tales. He used them to help people understand more abstract ideas like the transcendent function, when someone moves from this layer of understanding to another whole mindset. And he started to see that the people in his practice were telling him about dreams that they had, and they all had a similar hero story to them. And so they stopped being personal and started being about what he then deemed was the collective unconscious, and went on to say that the reason so many myths are the same is because it's a projection from the unconscious, the collective unconscious, that gives us a way of understanding each other on an unconscious level. So with all these big ideas in mind, I was thrilled to get my hands on your book because it calls for a new way of thinking about the hero. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, you can tell from the title of the book that I was referring to or standing on the shoulders of Joseph Campbell, who wrote in a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he was writing this book in the 1940s during the Second World War. It came out a few years later. And Campbell didn't really pay much attention to heroines. That is, he saw women as the goal of the hero. Well, 70 years later comes the global pandemic, and I am doing a lot of reading and processing basically a lifetime of reading. And before that, I begin noticing the heroines in stories from ancient times, but also in the stories that we tell today. And what I discovered is that these heroines are not warriors at all. They're not fighters, but they are curious, they are crafty, and they are caring. Those seem to be the features. They were never out on the journey, the hero's journey. They had to stay at home. And they engaged in the conspiratorial crafts, the domestic crafts, creating beauty. And also, to me, what is beautiful about the story of the heroine is that the holy grail for them is justice. That's what they're searching for.
That's such an important thread. These, because what you're really, I think, putting forward is there's another value system that, as we look at the heroine, she brings with her. And one of those that I was fascinated by was this idea of curiosity, this attribute of curiosity. Why is, in these times, why is it so important for us to highlight heroines for their curiosity?
Oh, well, I love that question, because curiosity is something that was demonized in past ages. That is, there's so many cautionary tales about curiosity getting you into trouble. Eve, for one thing, who is tempted by the snake, and because of her curiosity, she brings sin and evil into the world. And then there's the story of Pandora, who famously opens this box and brings toil and trouble into the world, leaving us with nothing but hope, which is a good thing, but you'd like to have a little bit more than that. And then all of these stories, as soon as children's literature begins, that is when we begin putting stories for children between the covers of a book, you have all these tales about curiosity as something that needs to be beaten out of the child, basically. Don't be curious because it's going to get you into trouble. And curiosity is linked with disobedience. Think Eve and Pandora again, this act of disobedience. So I think, somehow to just shift the calculus, to change things, you begin to realize that curiosity is actually what makes us human. And it took us, for better or for worse, I would say, to the top of the food chain. It's sort of what has enabled us to evolve, and one hopes also to become better. Now, we live in a culture that enshrines empathy as the greatest good. That is, there's now an empathy workbook for children. And if you go online and try to find books about empathy, you'll find hundreds of them. And I think empathy, is part of, that's one of the features of the heroine. I mentioned care, but that kind of, I think care is more important than empathy. That is, when you're curious, you're attentive to something and you care for it. So actually, craft, curiosity, and care are all semantically linked. They all belong together. And I think we need to sort of move from a culture of empathy, where, empathy is our cardinal virtue, to one that also values curiosity and the way that it can put us on the path to something better.
I think this is fascinating because we are, as many people talk about, we're at an interesting point in the civilization where we're beginning to rethink so many of our values and our behaviors because, there's some imperatives with the climate and the planet that would maybe cause us to think that we need to, we've got some catching up to do culturally. And
oh, yes, absolutely. And I always think of the fact that the planet, we refer to Mother Nature. And there's something interesting about that gender divide. That is, sometimes I think Mother Nature is taking her revenge on us, is showing her fangs at least.
it's that, I wonder in this care, creativity, or craft, I think you call it, and curiosity, the 3 C's of the heroine. I couldn't help but identify with the way you open the book and you tell the story of the graduate student showing up to Joseph Campbell's office. And she's looking for a different kind of relationship to the myth.
Oh, absolutely. And, there's Campbell at Sarah Lawrence, and he was heroic. Everyone loved him. His classes were mobbed. He had to limit enrollments. He was such a charming, erudite figure. And in marches this senior who says, I want to be the hero. And Campbell's worried because he thinks, well, you get to give birth to the hero. You're the goal of the hero. Isn't that enough? And she says, no, it's not enough. I want to be the hero. And I think that, she wasn't necessarily saying, I want to be the spiritual leader or I want to be the warrior, but I want to do something great and good. And heroines are always, for one thing, they have to worry about surviving. They can't go on these journeys often, but they have to figure out a way to survive in a world that is very tough and also protect those around them, that is, care for them, make sure that they too survive, and then change the culture in which they live. And I think that undergraduate at Sarah Lawrence was really thinking hard about how can I make the world better? How can I change things? It's around the time that Betty Friedan is telling us about the myth of the happy housewife. The myth in the negative sense of the term, that is not a story that is foundational and powerful and helps us navigate reality, but a lie, really, something that is not true. And I think she saw her destiny, to living out this myth of the happy housewife and wanted to change that.
So these values are, not only is it a way to interpret these heroine stories, but I think you call for sort of an elevation of these values. In other words, the stories we've been told in mythology, these are the missing stories, and they tend to belong to women. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. And there's a way in which, we've sort of idolized these natural born killers, Achilles, Hector, Hercules. They're all very good at grabbing weapons and going into armed combat. Then in ancient times also give us a whole, I would say one heroine after another, but we've never really explored them. And it hasn't been until, say, Margaret Atwood gives us the Penelope Odd, where we suddenly sort of look at the Odyssey in a completely different way and see that, Penelope was heroic. She was crafty. She was clever, and she did great things in order to serve. She also did some terrible things. Atwood does not whitewash anything. But we have Pat Barker in The Silence of the Girls, giving us the story of Briseis and how she survived, or Circe, Madeline Miller's blockbuster. That, what a fantastic novel that is. Suddenly, Circe is no longer a witch, but she's a healer. She's somebody who creates beauty in the world, and she has to she encounters these terrible people who land on her island and want to pillage and do terrible things. And she is a wonderful counterforce. And that we're finally getting these stories. And to be sure, it may not be the gospel truth in any sense of the term, but they ring true in powerful ways, and they give us an alternative, another way of looking at the world and thinking about what it means to do great, good things.
Well, it seems to me that that's your thesis, that we need more stories and more voices. We need a diversity, because we've really, the hero's story has been a warrior's story more than anything else. And, there's a breadth of human experience that isn't always, the adventure of life isn't always played out on a battlefield. There are many other ways to create meaning. And I think that, the other thing that you're talking about is really sort of the elevation of, the feminine powers and the feminine energy that has been, it's obviously a missing piece.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're right that there really should be many different models. And in the past, there's been a lot of gender trouble in our model for heroism. And there's a kind of strict bifurcation of, the warrior, the male, the masculine warrior hero on the one hand, and then the woman at home spinning, sewing, mending, healing, telling stories, which often speak truth to power. And there's this kind of stark bifurcation that I think is now sort of dissolving and disappearing, where men can now be heroines. They can take on the features that we've normally attributed to women. And at the same time, and I worry a little bit about this, we've got a whole series of new warrior women, that is these muscular, brawny, often hypersexualized women, as in Black Widow or Black Panther, or in that series Killing Eve, these female assassins who are, who do these, incredible gymnastics and are they're killer women in a way. So, I mean, I like the fact that we can now have these crossovers, but I worry about the fact that we may be still so stuck with the male warrior killer model, and not looking at the many other possibilities. Like, you can be a warrior and not necessarily be out to kill. You may be out to rescue and save too.
Well, among Jungians, there is a real fascination with the story of Psyche. For obvious reasons, right? The Latin is psyche, meaning, sort of the interface between the soul and the mind. And so, there is a fair bit of conversation that Psyche is really every woman. Her trials are every woman's trials that necessitate the process of individuation, which is really becoming a whole person, right? So, it's Psyche's story is a story of initiation, it strikes me. And as I was reading your book, I thought to myself, you talk about initiation and being specific to a lot of heroine stories. Why are we so fascinated with initiation?
Oh, I think, it's the whole idea of growing up and growing into yourself. And today we talk about self-actualization. That is, how do you get to be who you should be? How do you get to the point where you do something that nobody else can do? Something that makes you unique. So to me, there's nothing more important than that story about becoming essentially the person that you want to be, and becoming, well, as Nora Ephron puts it, become the hero of your own life. that is move away. Of course, at times you are going to be a victim, and there are going to be people who will be victims, and we can't deny that fact. But how do you turn that around? How do you move into the role of hero, heroine? And Psyche, I mean, that story it's not very long, but it is just packed with everything. Domestic drama, the rivalry with Venus, the rivalry with the sisters, marriage as loss, as a kind of death, and then falling in love and wanting intimacy, but then finding that your husband flees because you've looked at him, and then going on, those tasks that Psyche has to carry out, and succeeding in them, but also failing, and yet still finding a happily ever after. So it's an extraordinary story that, and I think, we don't have to just look at Apuleius's version of the story, but we're always making that story new. Jean Cocteau made it new in his story of Beauty and the Beast, which is a variant of Cupid and Psyche. So we're always, trying to sort of come to terms with all the issues that are raised by that tale.
You also mentioned in your book about Get Out, the movie Get Out, and how it is a modern retelling of the Bluebeard story, which is wow, what a crazy story that is. You talk about that.
Oh, well, Bluebeard was first written down at the end of the 17th century by a Frenchman named Charles Perrault, and it was framed as a story about women's curiosity. And the moral, Perrault even attached a moral that says, women, don't be so curious, it's going to get you in trouble. Well, this woman makes the mistake of marrying a wealthy man, and it's rumored, he's had many wives before, and it's rumored that he has done away with those wives. But she's under the spell of this charismatic figure. She marries him, and what does Bluebeard do? He says, I'm going to give you this key, the keys to the house, and you can open any door you want. You can go anywhere you want, but don't go into the room that you can open with this key. Don't open this door. And here's the key to it, by the way. Well, of course, I said, the minute you get this prohibition, you violate it in a fairy tale. It's like telling a kid, don't open this door to the candy store.
Right.
And so what does she do? She crosses the threshold, and she discovers on the walls the corpses of his previous wives. And I won't go into all of the details, but, she's actually very smart because to disobey, that is, her curiosity is what rescues her, because in the end, she manages to escape her husband, who is planning to behead her. And she is rescued by her brothers in the end. But that's a story that exists in many different variations. Sometimes she calls her little dog, and her dog is the one who saves her. So you never know how the story is going to be retold and rejiggered. It's almost kaleidoscopic. But in Get Out, and I don't want to give too much away, we have a reversal of the roles, where suddenly Chris is in the role of Bluebeard's wife, and he is the one who is vulnerable. I mean, it's a story about what it is like to be Black in America. He is the one who is vulnerable. He is imperiled, and he has to figure out a way to get out, to save himself, to rescue himself from evil pure and simple. And he has to use his wits and be the crafty one.
And it seems also that these discoveries, beginning with the Bluebeard discovery, and then all the iterations of that story, there's an awakening. So there's a loss of innocence, right? Oh, isn't this lovely? I'm just having dinner with my girlfriend's parents, right. Or I'm the new bride, and I'm checking out the household. And there's an awakening that, you know, a loss of innocence. And this had me also very fascinated by your book, because you talk about the hero's calling, and it's different for the heroine. You talk about the epiphany, and that is something that Carl Jung was fascinated by. He believed that epiphanies lead most likely to transcendence, and we actually are built for epiphanies. And you know, epiphanies have a very specific, they're numinous, they're vivid. There's a sense that there's an otherworldly force at work.
Yeah, right.
And you talk about this as this is the calling for the heroine. I was struck by that.
Right. And you know, if you think about epiphany, you know, originally it was used to describe a transcendent moment, a sort of a religious experience. I always think of Saint Teresa and her epiphany, and you know, it's kind of scary to see her so helpless, so, you know, giving in to this force. And I think there's a different kind of epiphany, that awakening, that moment of awakening where everything clicks and you realize, like Scheherazade, let's say, Scheherazade, who is under the threat of murder. Marriage is an institution haunted by the threat of murder. We get that again and again in fairy tales. She has to figure out a way to save herself, to keep Shahryar from decapitating her the next morning. And I think, you know, in a sense, her understanding of the power of story, this moment in which she realized, I'm going to tell him a story, I'm going to stop it halfway through, arouse his curiosity, and I'll save my neck for one more night. And by the way, I'm also going to use that storytelling to educate him. So, you know, it's this moment of crafting, of being supremely conscious, not just, you know, passive like Saint Teresa and giving in to this other force, but also feeling connected with everything and realizing that the only way you're going to survive this is to be sharp and to do something that is spectacular, that no one has ever done before, and that will get you out of the worst possible imaginable situation.
You're calling up something as well about Cassandra. I want to shift gears with Cassandra's story, because again, there's a story where people often say every woman is Cassandra, in that she was given the gift to see beyond, to see ahead, and yet no one would listen to her or believe her. So her, what's your take on Cassandra?
I remember growing up with Greek myths, you know, being under the spell of them. And Cassandra to me was this mad woman. You know, when I pictured her hair sort of flying in the wind, almost snake-like, almost a Medusa-like figure. And in fact, you know, when you read about her, you see, I mean, she's always babbling and saying these things that everyone thinks are totally absurd. Well, look at her. I mean, she has the gift of prophecy. It's been given to her by Apollo, who takes it back because he sees her as a kind of tease. She won't give in to his sexual advances. So he curses her with lack of credibility. And in fact, you know, she warns everyone about the Trojans. She warns them about Paris. Don't let Paris go to, you know, don't let him abduct Helen. She warns them about the Trojan horse. And there she is with axe in one hand and what is it, a torch in the other to try to destroy the Trojan horse. And she looks like a lunatic and everyone thinks she is. And then, I mean, if you think of her fate, the fact that she's taken back by Agamemnon, takes her home as his concubine, and she's killed by Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra. She's killed by Clytemnestra. So she is the supreme victim. And I think she becomes a kind of allegory of how women in our culture have been silenced, that they speak truth to power, but no one wants to believe them. And I think that's something that has really changed. Women's voices, I mean, look at the Me Too movement. Women's voices are now being heard. People are paying attention. They're sitting up and listening when stories are told. And I think it's so significant that there's stories. We're not in the courtroom. We're in the court of public opinion, which has become a powerful force. No wonder the judiciary is upset about it, because suddenly there's this alternative to the courtroom, which is often not paid attention to women's stories.
I think the hashtag Me Too movement was also really important because it wasn't one myth being told to many people. It was many people contributing to a storyline where after a while, the accumulation of it was undeniable. And I think participating in that moment, that cultural moment, I was also stunned at just the plentitude of so many stories. And you could tell the way people were writing them, they were heartfelt, they were sincere, they had detail that made it very clear that this is what happened to me. And I just wonder how something like the internet, I'm going to ask you to kind of in the next couple of minutes, pull out your crystal ball. How is it changing the way we experience mythological stories and create new myths?
Well, in some ways, of course, the Me Too movement gives us reality, the bite of reality. And fairy tale and myth are in the realm of fiction. But I often think, fairy tales, for example, I mean, myth is sort of high culture. Fairy tale, we associate with the domestic. We see them as children's stories. But in fact, they were old wives' tales. And they were produced by a collective. It's not Homer telling a story. And Homer, I mean, we don't know, was he sort of a collective, but, it's not a bard or a rhapsode or a single storyteller, but a woman in a spinning room who is telling her story to other women, who is improvising, and the story gets tweaked by the audience. So in a way, it's a collective production. It's one story, but it's one story that then also exists in an infinite variety and infinite forms of variation. That is, there's not one Bluebeard story. You can find Bluebeard all over the world. You can find Little Red Riding Hood all over the world. She may not always have a red hood, but it's a girl, a wolf, a monster in the woods, a beast in the wood, a predator in the woods. So these stories are told all over the world. It's kind of a collective speaking. And it's not real, but I love the way that fairy tales begin in some cultures. It was, and it was not. So there is truth to this story that is fiction. There's more than a kernel of truth to it. So now we have a new medium. And I worry about the fact that, social media is kind of another form of unpaid labor, women telling their stories, and who's capitalizing on it but Google, Facebook, or Twitter. But it's a great form of labor because it is a way of bringing us together. And, the downside is, of course, there will always be people who say, oh, these stories are made up. They can't all be true. But the force of the multitude, what you just, you can't stop it. I think somebody was once describing it as a kind of prairie fire. And it just, there is no stopping it. It has an incredible power to it. And I think that we have to use that more. That is, I'd like to see somebody start a hashtag Me Too for abortion, for women tell, and there's been some of that, but I think not enough. There has to be more momentum behind that.
Yes, I'm waiting to see what the reaction is going to be, because I agree with you. I think that the hashtag Me Too movement was a great projection of the fears that women have, that they will be like Cassandra, they will be talking about their reality and no one will be listening to them. And I think you make that point about Cassandra, that, her true gift is that she sees the world for what it is. And then she's able to make a prognostication based on that reality. And that's a subtle, what you're really talking about is a high level of discernment, I guess.
Oh, yes. And I often think of it in terms of, what your mother tells you. Your mother is always right. And for two reasons, partly because she's reading the signals, but also there's something about ancestral wisdom. And I think, the collective unconscious is part of that. Toni Morrison once wrote, listen to the ancestor. Listen to those ancestral voices and pick them up in the airwaves. And there's something there that you have to pay attention to and bring into your own life.
I think that might explain why millennials and Gen Zs are so fascinated about their DNA, and they're purchasing tests, 21andMe, to really understand where they come from.
That's right. And Henry Louis Gates Jr. Look at the people that look at the expressions on the faces of the people he has interviewed. And you see how important it is to them to understand their genealogy, where they come from, what their roots are, what their family tree looks like. It gets back to that idea, too, of self-actualization, understanding who your ancestors were and what you want to become. So looking backwards and then looking forward as well. So both parts of that, I think, are really important.
You remind me of I had a letter written to me from an uncle who was living in the old country. My mother was an immigrant. And so all of her brothers and sisters, were still back in the old country. And there was a line that was in his letter, and I repeat it to my kids, and they repeat it to others, and that was, nobody belonging to us ever died in the poorhouse. Meaning, take the risk, be brave. You're going to be fine. That's what we do, and it's very bolstering to know that that's a lineage for our family, to be brave.
Absolutely. There are these, they're almost like folk wisdom, family wisdom. Sometimes it takes the form of story. Sometimes it's just a phrase that is passed on from one generation to another. And it is a kind of, we were talking about epiphanies before, it is a kind of magical moment that is where you feel connected with your past, but also you may be, repeating that phrase or that story with others in your family, and it becomes a kind of bonding agent as well.
I wonder if, you spend your life, your career, Maria, looking at, the past, stories from the past, fairy tales from the past. And yet, when I was reading your book, I couldn't help but feel like the narrator had one foot in the past and one foot in the future. And you were looking, the narrator's looking ahead to what the world might be like if we did have more and different stories, and we had we featured more heroines, or we shone the light on heroines that we do have, and to reveal different sides of them. When you were writing about that, what was your vision? What could you, as a kind of Cassandra, see we might be able to achieve as a civilization if we had more diversity in our stories?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's something nostalgic about the book. I mentioned that I'm sort of processing a lifetime of reading and teaching, and also listening to my students. And I mean, I kind of feel that my students also co-wrote this book with me, but I'm also so deeply invested in making these stories new. That is, we can't sort of stay with these stories from that. They're not written in granite. Even the Bible, we think of it as a sacred text. I worry about that term sacred. I prefer irreverence. That is, we have to sort of look at these older texts and older stories and discover what is relevant to us, and then figure out ways to make it new. And yes, I am looking at the next generation and thinking about their creative spirit and what they can do. And particularly, since so much is changing so rapidly in our world, and many of these opportunities that my generation had, in the world of publishing, in the world of journalism, in the world of teaching even, are shrinking and these sort of creative opportunities. I mean, at the same time, we've had this sort of democratization of artistic production. So I guess, I'm so curious to see how the next generation is going to navigate the waters, how they're going to find opportunities to preserve these stories, pass them on to their own children, and make them more interesting and more relevant.
That's an exciting idea, Maria. And thank you for all your vision. Thank you for what is a beautifully researched and talked about book. We will make sure that we post a link to it. And I look forward to the world that you describe, a world that has heightened interest in care and curiosity and craft. And I hope it does lead us to a more just world.
I hope so. I hope that we continue to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice.
Thank you.
Thanks, too.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like more information about training programs, archives, this podcast, or to find a Jungian analyst near you, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Thank you to our 2021 donors who gave at the contributing member level or above: the Arlene M. Feiner Trust, Barbara Annan, Arlo and Rena Compan, Judith Cooper, Kevin Davis, George J. Didier, Mary Doherty, Carl and Patricia Greer, Ryan Mayer, Patricia Martin, Boris Matthews, Sue Rosenthal, Diane Sherwood, Debbie Stutzman, Lawrence Chad Tingley, Alexander Wayne and Lynn Kopp, Gerald Weiner, and Ellen Young. You can also become a supporter of this podcast by visiting our website, jungchicago.org. Thanks.